Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the short talk, Emotional Support Animal Letters, What Are They and Who Can Write One? Which is tracked for our animal welfare audience who so often find themselves in the position of being the advocate for people and their animals and keeping people with their emotional support animals. We are very lucky to have Dr. Janet Hoy-Gerlach lead this talk for us because she's an incredible content area expert. Dr. Hoy-Gerlach is a social worker, educator, and researcher seeking to improve the well-being of people and non-human animals through recognition and support of the human-animal bond in health and mental health care and human services. Toward that end, she founded One Health People Animal Wellness to assist in developing services that mutually support human and animal well-being. She authored Human-Animal Interaction, a social work guide, along with her colleague Scott Wayman. This book was published by NASW Press in 2017. Dr. Hoy-Gerlach presents and trains internationally on therapeutic animal roles and health and mental health benefits of human-animal interaction. She has also served as an expert witness on emotional support animals for the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and recently completed a study detailing the benefits of emotional support animals that can be accessed for free, and we have provided that as a link in Whova. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Hoy-Gerlach. Please begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Christine. Very pleased to be here. So I want to share my screen. Here we go. So to start us out, I want to share with you a clip. It was in a newspaper a few years ago that really struck me. And I know you can read it, but I want to read it to you just to highlight some parts. I'm curled in a ball on my bed, staring into space. I've spent the day trying to fend off a mental health episode to be productive and to keep myself distracted, but a depressed exhaustion has descended on me. All my limbs are heavy, and I feel like I can't move. One of my cats, a black and white Tom called Ernest Hemingway, comes to sit on me. He reaches out with one paw, so he's touching me. He almost always does this when I'm feeling vulnerable or upset. He's a big, heavy cat, and the weight of him makes me feel grounded. His purring is comforting. I no longer feel so alone and tangled in my own sadness. When he gets up to investigate a sound in another room, I find that I'm able to get up too. So, as you were listening to this, you were no doubt getting some mental images. So here's Pernest and the therapeutic paw here, and here is the author. And going back to this for a moment, if we look through this, we can see several things that Ernest does that helps her mental health. And if I ask, do you think Ernest was trained to do any of these things? Think your answer? To my knowledge, the answer is no. No, he is not. He is doing cat things of the sort of, from a cat that is socialized and enjoys human company and is bonded to the author. And yet, we could pull out numerous benefits in here. So up here, she is debilitated by her symptoms of her mental health issue. Her cat, first of all, approaches her, sits on her. So physically is now providing weight, warmth, or heat from his body, the texture of his fur. He puts out his paw. And then the purring vibrations, she's finding emotionally comforting. It's also doing what we call grounding, which is helping people become more present in their physical body when their nervous regulation system is taking them more into like a freeze, or clinically we would call that even disassociation, disconnecting as a stress response. And then of course, companionship. She feels less alone, and her sadness is alleviated. So some emotional comfort. He, as cats will do, goes to investigate a sound. However, he, at this point, after these experiences with Ernest, finds that she is now able to get up, whereas she previously was not able to move. At least that was her, perceived lived experience. So question, is Ernest Hemingway an emotional support animal? Hold your answer. We're going to go through some things, and we're gonna reconnect with that. So here's Ernest again, and I love his little paw. Here is another situation that's probably pretty familiar to many of you, and it's a composite. I wanted to protect confidentiality. This is, we're going to call her Janelle Doe, trying to get to Shelter X with her mixed breed dog, Cookie. And the Janelle is well known to the shelter staff. They report she's been in and out of hospitals, psychiatric hospitals for many years, but she does not follow up with the outpatient service appointments she has. She struggles with ongoing paranoia, which is a barrier to her, feeling comfortable connecting with those, appointments and services. So she's repeatedly been discharged from hospitals to the shelter. They have the discharge information sent over, but then she does not stay at the shelter. So she's been on the streets on and off several years. About 9 months ago, she started approaching the staff herself, asking for help for dog food. And she told the staff she found a stray dog she was calling Cookie. Um, and as these conversations, about Cookie took place and the staff were able to help connect her with some resources, they, staff and Janelle started to develop a rapport. And the rapport was around Cookie's needs. If we want to put that into social service speak, Janelle was starting to engage with the shelter staff, whereas she had not before. And that culminated in Janelle, becoming willing for the first time to access the shelter and connect with some of the shelter's other support services. However, Shelter X permits only service animals and ESAs, with an ESA letter, being required by shelter policy, documentation. Okay, we have Janelle. Janelle does not have a service provider. Janelle's very symptoms of her mental health condition are creating barriers to her connecting to ongoing services. And Cookie is helping to mitigate that. So a struggle that was happening is they could not find any mental health clinician to write the letter or healthcare provider. The responses they got were, she's not my client. She needs to do a consent to treat. I have to do a diagnostic assessment. So no letter, no access was how this was posed. One of the responses that the shelter staff got were she needs a disability evaluation before she can have an emotional support animal. True or false? Where you see common fallacies, I gave that away in that slide, didn't I? Disability must be determined in a separate formal disability evaluation, as is done for entitlement-related disability benefit eligibility. Now, there is a mouthful. What the heck am I talking about? Workers' comp, income, Social Security, income. So the entitlement basically is, those are different benefits, different policies, and those focus on a person's ability to work. But let's think about that. I am certain we all know folks with disabilities. We may be folks with disabilities that work and work a lot. So the idea that you can't have a disability and work is ludicrous. So these kinds of policies have a very high threshold. They require a high level of disability, such that your work is very impaired, and then you get income support. That is not what is needed for disability determination in housing accommodation. That's a completely different kind of policy. So false. Different thresholds. ESAs are recognized under the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act doesn't give people income as a safety net. The Fair Housing Act is an anti-discrimination law to ensure that people have access to housing, including people with, different ability, race, ethnic group, gender, etc. HUD actually, that's the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, clarified that certain mental health disorders automatically meet the Fair Housing Act definition of disability, which we'll look at in all cases, virtually all cases: major depressive disorder, bipolar, PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia. So if you're working with somebody that has a history of that, you have documentation of that in a discharge summary, you can check that, that is met. They have met that piece of emotional support animal eligibility. They have a disability according to HUD. Now, the flip side is most people with these diagnoses do not meet the eligibility for Social Security or workers' comp, because that requires a threshold, a level of symptoms to the point ongoing where they can't work. And there are many, many people with these diagnoses that are out there working all kinds of jobs, doing amazing things. So how do animals help us? How was Pernus helping his person? There's what we call natural benefits of human-animal interaction. These are called natural basically to sort of distinguish them from the kinds of benefits that animals give us when they're taught to do things. Natural are just the things that kind of naturally happen if we're interacting with an animal that is, either domesticated or socialized, positive toward humans generally, or their human in particular. And these fall in a biopsychosocial framework: biological, psychological, social, and then emotional is sometimes broken out. And there's scientific research emerging that supports each of these. So up here we have the physical. We have somebody that's, running with their dog, walking, even playing with your cat, moving is one kind of physical. Another kind is the contact that we get physically from our animals. We're hardwired as social mammals, and that contact comforts us and actually shifts our nervous system out of fight, flight. It can help to do that into calm, or out of, like with Pern's person was having that freeze, that disconnect, back up to sort of calm and socially connected. Both of those fall under physical. Because with the contact with animals, it releases a bonding hormone called oxytocin, which slows our heart rate, our respiration rate, our blood pressure, and helps our body shift into that middle state, social connection. Psychological, we feel needed. Our animals depend on us for care. Here's somebody feeding their animal. Many instances of people taking better care of themselves because their animals depend on them. In the case of Janelle and Cookie, Janelle wasn't, as concerned about her own food. But when Cookie, and she would share her food with Cookie, but she wanted Cookie to have, food every day, proper meal time. So not for herself, but for Cookie, Janelle reached out to shelter staff, pushed through that paranoia, that for her is real. That's important to, we gotta, paranoia from our side is okay, there's not a real threat, but for the person, it's scary and it takes a lot of courage. Social, direct and indirect. This is direct. Somebody's coming home and look at this happy kitty. And again, not trained, kitty's just happy to see their person. That's a direct social benefit. Company. Indirect is all the ways that animals help us connect to other people, which is great, in general, but for people who struggle, socially or with isolation, this can be an incredible, bridge. Even, as simple as walking a dog or having a kitty sit in your apartment window. People will approach you, talk to you, they see pictures of your animal, and you start to create connection with like-minded people. And then emotional is sometimes broken out as those feelings of comfort. So here's a woman and her dog. Again, I don't think this is trained. They're just resting and they look very comforted together. So all of these, if we think back to that Pernest example, there was the biologic, he was sitting on her, grounding her, psychological, social, she felt less alone, emotional, she felt comforted. And these working together in research literature, they call that the stress mediation effect. Basically, these things work together to reduce our human stress response. So if we're way up in fight, flight, our heart's racing, or blood pressure's up, we may be hyperventilating, those calming things that happen to us with animals when we pet them help bring us down. If we're disconnecting, it can help bring us back to our body. So these benefits help to mediate our stress response as humans. Therapeutic, this is a word that's thrown around a lot. I thought we could take a common sense look at it. Merriam Dictionary. Remedial agents, methods, beneficial effect on body or mind, favorable or useful result or effect. We think about Pernest, very straightforward. She started out feeling like she was not able to get out of her bed. Pernest visited, Pernest left. Again, no special training. Pernest was just doing Pernest things. However, at the end of that interaction, she then felt able to get up, and she did so. So how can animals help or be therapeutic, natural, and training? Training is what we often think of. This dog is highly trained to help people with visual disabilities, things like crossing the street. However, emotional support animals, like this kitty in this picture, I don't know if this kitty's in an ESA, but this isn't trained. This is comfort. This is, companionship, affection, but it's still beneficial. And here's just the roles: pets, emotional support animals. I don't, with this dog could be either. And we'll talk about how we know the difference. Therapy animals are animals that are brought in to help other people, not their handler. And of course, service animals back to their handlers, but highly trained. So what is an emotional support animal? No different than a pet in terms of what they do behaviorally. No special training. It is the impact of the interactions that becomes therapeutic for people. And for some folks, it reduces distress and impairment related to their disability. So for Cookie, Cookie helped Janelle to push through her paranoia, which was, literally a barrier to her connecting with the help she needed. Pernest helped his person get out of bed. These weren't things these animals were trained to do. It's through the natural interaction. And there is some limited legal protection. ESA comes from the Fair Housing Act. Air Carrier Access Act used to be a place where they were recognized, but that has changed. So they are no longer considered accommodations in airspace. Housing Act, FHA, just if you remember nothing, it prohibits discrimination in dwellings. So housing, including shelters. And you see here the different kinds of protected groups, including people with disabilities. FHA states animals who provide emotional support that alleviates one or more identified effects of a person's disability are not pets, but rather they are a subtype of assistance animals. So they use this as an umbrella, and then they have emotional support animals and those task trained, like guide dogs and hearing assistance dogs. So both of those are considered under the umbrella. A person with a disability may request an ESA as a reasonable accommodation for a dwelling. So to be clear, under the FHA, ESAs are considered, their companionship is considered a disability accommodation. They are not a pet. Therefore, their people cannot be prohibited from having their animal in no pet housing. They can't be charged a deposit. They can't be charged pet fees. And to be clear, this is from a HUD 2020 memo clarifying, here's the link. Housing includes emergency shelters and homeless shelters. So there's question about that. Let that be put to rest. This was put out now 3 years ago. And again, FHA definition, what is an emotional support animal? A companion needed due to the therapeutic impact on that person's condition. The condition meets the definition of FHA. And the animal helps to alleviate that distress or impairment. We think back to the examples, Janelle's paranoid symptoms, Pernest, Hemingway's persons, difficulty. And here is more on guidelines. This is actually that HUD memo again, 2020. It's good to have. I highlighted where they include these. So if you have documentation of these kinds of disorders, that doesn't mean others are not disabilities. But if you've got these documented, you've already got part one of the definition. So do they have the definition of disability? And will the animal be expected to help? And if so, how? And it can be straightforward. Again, I keep going back to the examples. One way this can be verified is through clinical information, through a health or mental health care provider, and they can provide more detail. These are my person's diagnosis. These are the symptoms I'm treating them for. And this is how the animal helps. However, it does not have to be as complex as that. If it's a parent, this person couldn't get out of bed and now they can. That person couldn't access, shelter for herself or support services to help her come off the street. The dog and the connection there enabled her to be able to push through that paranoia to make the connections. Those are alleviating impairments related to the person's condition. So who can verify and write what are called ESA letters if a housing provider requires or requests them? Housing providers are not required to have documentation of an animal in order to treat that animal as an ESA. I'll say that again. Housing providers are not required to have documentation of animals as ESAs in order to give the person accommodation. And to be clear, I am not a lawyer. I'm a clinical social worker. I just consult very regularly with animal accommodation law specialists. And as Christine mentioned, I do some expert witness work with the U.S. Department of Justice. So they share with me a lot. And the letter is not required for the housing provider, be it a shelter or apartment, to provide the fair accommodation. However, it is their right to request a letter. They can request a letter. They are allowed to do that. So who can write such a letter? This is from the Fair Housing Center. It's a nonprofit. What I liked about this is this last little bullet arrow thing, which clarifies it can be a clinician, reliable third party. We often think of them as healthcare providers, care provider, or another reliable third party. So health information is one of the primary ways that this is verified. However, again, it is differentiated: social worker, case manager, or other reliable third party. What do we need to provide in a letter? Person has the disability defined within fair housing law. If you're a healthcare provider, you may have diagnosed it. If you're a housing, crisis shelter provider, you may have documentation, or you may have, reliable information yourself. You've got a call from the hospital and they said person X has been here, with this diagnosis, we're referring them. So you have information that you're able to rely upon in order to verify they have the disability. And then the animal need, how is the animal offsetting, either distress or impairment? related to their disability. And again, to clarify, care providers, reliable third parties may include, but are not limited to, doctors, mental and behavioral health professionals, social workers, case managers, even family members and coworkers may be able to reliably document. Now, housing providers may request healthcare providers. However, a crisis housing professional is a professional service. It's a form of knowledge, and part of what you draw from is from the healthcare providers. So if you haven't diagnosed, let's say PTSD, you got that from somewhere. So that would be what you put in your own, in-house documentation, not in the letter. The letter is pretty simple. Here's a template. You're writing as a, care provider, reliable third party, or in a position to know. You don't have to say how, but I would encourage you to document that so that you have that if anybody pushes back. Well, how do you know? Well, the state hospital, Janet Hoy-Gerlach, sent a discharge summary. Here's the diagnosis, and then how the animal helps. So think about Cookie, think about Pernest. And again, simple, affects their ability to access, services due to, mental health symptom barriers, or it affects their ability to, engage in activities of daily living due to mental health, symptom barriers. That's Pernest person being sort of weighed down. Literally, she felt like her limbs were heavy. And back to this case example. So if we think about Janelle Doe now, we've got some discharge summaries from the state hospital that could be looked at by, crisis housing professionals and drawn from. We have the conversations. So firsthand, we can see how the dog is helping. We could also ask the person. People are experts of their own experiences. In Janelle's case, she may not be very forthcoming or even want to talk about any of that. She may not have insight or recognition of her paranoia, and asking might actually push her away. But for some folks coming to a shelter, they could tell you, like Pernest person, for example, could say, this is how, to give you a better understanding of how the animal helps offset the distress and impairment related to their mental health condition. So thank all of you, many thanks to all that you do. And I hope that this has been helpful in highlighting for you and helping, to empower you to support your, folks in accessing, emergency housing shelters with their emotional support animals. Again, if the animal is providing, assistance that reduces distress and impairment to that person's disability, that is an emotional support animal. The letter verifies it, but verification means it already is happening and we're verifying it, right? If I'm verifying something, it doesn't mean I'm creating it. It means, oh, it's there and I'm verifying that I see it there. That's what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Janet. And to everybody who is watching in the audience, please stick around for a live Q&A in just a moment.
Thank you, Christine.